Welcome to the PharmaSource podcast. Today's interview is with Dr. Jeff Kiplinger, formerly scientific leader at Pfizer turned entrepreneur. Jeff is the best-selling author of Expert to Entrepreneur, a book about all he learned from founding, scaling, and ultimately selling a contract research organisation. It's a fascinating book for anyone who's founded a business or is thinking about it, but particularly for founders with a background in science as Jeff has. His business was Averica Discovery Services, a CRO based in the Boston area, which was ultimately acquired by Neopharm. Today, Jeff advises contract service providers on how to get better at selling science, which is also the name of his consultancy. I'm pleased to say Jeff will deliver a lightning talk at CDMO Live on the topic of how contract manufacturers should align sales and marketing. So if you work in contract manufacturing, you don't want to miss that. Sign up to pharmasource.global/CDMO Live for your free ticket.
The PharmaSource podcast is sponsored by Thermo Fisher Scientific. Thermo Fisher Scientific provides industry-leading pharma services for drug development, clinical trial logistics, commercial manufacturing, and clinical research. They partner with customers in the pharmaceutical, biotech, and life sciences industries as their trusted CDMO to deliver medicine to patients faster.
On with the interview. Going back to the beginning, what was it that motivated you to leave the comfortable role that you were in to taking the massive risk of launching your business? What was your driver to making that ridiculous step?
Yeah, it was kind of a ridiculous step in a way. I mean, I think I began to chafe at Pfizer, under the working arrangements there, when I realized that what a big company like Pfizer really wants you to do is to continue to provide the same level of expertise that you were hired for. Mm-hmm. And we frequently people refer to this as being siloed, right? You're stuck where you were when you were brought in. And it's perfectly fine to ride out a 30, 40-year career, doing something that you do well again and again and again, and knowing that it contributes. But after a while, I wanted to learn more. I really enjoyed my first 5 years there working with some of the brightest scientists I ever encountered in my entire life. But there was a sort of hands-off on the business side of things attitude. Pfizer began to move people into management, but I was too valuable as the scientist that I'd been hired as, and so I didn't get that opportunity. And I began to complain about that a little bit to my management, and that gradually turned into personal conflict with a particular manager that I had. And when I could see that I was on my way out of the company, we agreed to part ways in a way that I could tolerate.
Yeah, it can get quite political, can't it?
Yeah, it does. It does. And it's just that Pfizer was a much smaller pharmaceutical company when I joined. And when I left 10 years later, it was very, very close to becoming the largest pharma company in the world. And then they achieved that goal soon after with acquisitions of Warner Lambert and other companies later on. So Pfizer got frustrating for me, and I always thought, well, I should take my own show on the road and start a company that would contribute my expertise to a wider variety of customers than I had internally at Pfizer, and I'll make more money that way. Well, it turns out that that it's harder to do that than I thought, and there was a fairly long learning curve, about 6 or 7 years, where it took me some time to understand how to put something together that could be profitable. And I tried consulting, and I tried building out a group of operations professionals, and I tried building a business unit for a Midwestern instrument company. All of those things worked to some extent and were great learning experiences, but they weren't the end game. When I finally started a contract research firm that really was about analytical development of small molecule pharmaceuticals.
And this was Averica, which ultimately got acquired by Neopharm.
Exactly. Yeah. So when I started Averica, we really went operational at the very beginning of 2008. I had quite a bit of knowledge under my belt from the earlier efforts to try and establish a company on my own. And that helped, but I still needed to learn how to sell. I still needed to learn how to manage cash flow because we hit that great recession in late 2008.
Yeah, great timing. Yeah.
To our credit, to my lab staff credit, and I guess to some extent to my credit, we rode that out, and every year was a growth year. So we didn't have a decline in revenues. We'd started strong, and we managed to maintain some strength going every year through the recession.
Interesting to know just roughly what kind of investment is needed to set up a CRO. I imagine it's considerable in terms of upfront outlay. You've got facilities, you've got staff, you've got equipment, quite a serious upfront investment there.
Well, it is. And, I think I was a little bit naive about that, but I got lucky too, because in 2006, 2007, when I was beginning to fundraise for Averica, bank lending was, what's the best word for me to use? Sloppy and carefree. So everyone was throwing money around like there was going to be a continuous growth cycle for forever and ever and ever, and nobody seemed to see the recession coming in the average banking world. So I was able to borrow all of the money that I needed to put together the equipment complement. As a matter of fact, before the recession started, we doubled down and bought more equipment because we were so busy, and we were worried that the complement of instruments that we had, if we lost one of them, it would be a significant interruption in work and revenue. So we wanted duplication. We wanted backup on all of our machines. So we bought twice as much as I initially anticipated before the end of the first year. Then the recession hit. So there was even more of a cash crunch. But I've been fortunate enough to borrow, additional working capital, establish lines of credit during that period of time when banking was so free and easy. So that got us through to some extent. But when we began to run out of money in 2009, because there simply wasn't a lot of business coming in that first year after the market crashed, I went to a bunch of advisors that I knew and asked, what should I do in this situation? I opened up my books, and they took a look. And one very wise gentleman said to me, listen, you've got 6 weeks of money left. You've got enough to make 3 more payrolls at best, maybe 2. Why don't you go out and try and land a big deal?
Yeah.
So I did. I went to, I won't name the company, but it was one of the major pharmas. Worked my network there, established a research collaboration with them. And then I demanded from their purchasing department that we get a third of the money up front.
Wow. Inspiring stuff, considering the way that payment terms are going at the moment.
Yeah. And, we hadn't hit that really bad stretch yet. We were still getting payment terms of 30 to 45 days from most of the pharma companies. I understand that some of them, I think Pfizer, Merck, one of the big ones, is paying on net 120 terms now, which is just kind of crazy for a small company to try and do business with a big one like Pfizer or Merck is very, very difficult nowadays.
One of the key messages I took away from the book is around finding your niche and staying in it, focusing on your ideal customer, not being tempted to be a jack of all trades. I'm quite interested in 2 things with that. One is, how do you find that niche? How do you identify the niche which you can see, the right combination of our expertise and the right combination of ideal customer group, and get traction there? And then the second part, and I think there's always a real temptation to do this, it's to say yes to whatever a paying customer wants. Maybe if we start off with the finding that ideal niche, please.
You're asking about 5 different questions there, I think, in that one statement.
Let's take them one at a time.
They're all very interesting. I mean, in terms of finding a niche, we all have a niche, right? Most of us that are scientists have one specific thing that we are expert in. And it's that expertise that you're trying to take on the road when you've found your company. That's very, very tempting. I mean, my background in terms of technology is mass spectrometry and chromatography. And so it's very, very tempting to say, well, I know the ins and outs of HPLC and mass specs, so I can take anything you can do with a mass spectrometer and anything you can do with a chromatography system, and I can make it into a service.
Hmm.
But if I do that, I'm casting around for a customer that's very, very poorly defined. And it's much easier to market directly to someone that's more tightly defined.
Mm.
So I always say to people, what is the narrowest possible definition of what you do that brings the greatest value to a customer? That defines your ideal customer's profile.
Hmm.
Your ideal customer is the one that you bring the highest value to, not the one that pays you the most necessarily, not the one that you like the best. Those could be components of it as well. But the one that you bring the greatest value to is the one you're going to be the most successful with.
Hmm.
If you find somebody else that you can work with, great. But you have to ask yourself, am I bringing good value to this person? Because otherwise, they're going to be. If I bring less value to somebody than the cost of the work that I do, they're going to go away at the end with a bad taste in their mouth about having worked with me.
Hmm.
I paid $50,000 for work that I could have gotten someplace else for $15,000. That's a bad way to leave a customer relationship.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
those relationships tend to disintegrate not at the very end, but someplace in the middle.
Mm.
And so suddenly that customer is demanding a lot more out of you. They want more value. They want more for the dollars that they're spending. Um, and it doesn't go well.
Yeah. So how do you defend against that and resist the temptation to say yes to deals which may not be good for you in the first place? And when you've taken them on, scope creep can gradually change. And maybe you thought you were taking on one project and it morphs into something else. How do you manage that?
Well, that's, I think, one of the lessons that I learned within the first 2 or 3 years of running Averica was that we did try to take all comers. And I
Mm.
see this a lot in smaller companies that are fairly young. You're so focused on operations that any work that comes in that you can accomplish in your laboratory is something that you'll go after.
Hmm.
But what I learned was that if I could make a recommendation to somebody that I was speaking with of a better place for them to get the work done, a better company for them to work with, somebody that had a greater degree of expertise, and I learned over time that eventually my customers were going to find those places where the expertise was greater anyway. So there wasn't any harm to me in revealing that in my conversations with them.
Mm.
But if I could tell them that also gave me an opportunity to tell them exactly where they should come back to us.
Hmm.
So listen, you should go to these guys and get this work done there. But if in the future you need this, we're the people that you should be talking to. And
Mm.
that left not only with a favorable impression of working with me, but it left them with an idea of where they might work with me in the future.
Yep.
And I
Yep.
usually found that people came back to us when they had a need that was specific to what we could do.
Hmm. Hmm.
The other thing that I would frequently do is if we got into a relationship that turned out to be a bad one, we'd just try and finish the work as quickly as possible and make sure that we remember that customer relationship for future reference.
Really interesting. Often when you walk around an event, when you walk around a trade show, you'll often see lots of contract service providers, be they CROs, CMOs, CDMOs, and it looks like they're all offering the same thing, or at least the positioning for many, many companies seems to be very, very similar. It seems like it's maybe more of a challenge, perhaps for larger companies who have got so many different services. They end up just wrapping it up into much more of a generalist marketing message versus specialisms. How do you avoid just being just yet another end-to-end, we'll do everything for you market positioning?
I think it's a great question, and it's a question that uh, pops up in a lot of different aspects of how the service providers do business.
Hmm.
Trade shows are a great example because people walk past your booth in a trade show and they either catch something that resonates with them quickly, almost
Mm.
instantaneously, or they don't, and they walk on past. So you have to be um, visually and graphically interesting enough for them to read a little bit, just like a website,
Hmm.
right? But you also have to talk about what might be valuable to them. And you can't try and do this for everybody. Not everybody passing your booth is a potential customer. So again, focusing on who you provide the greatest value for. And then instead of talking about what you do on your booth message, on your backsplash of your booth, talk about what you do for your customers.
Hmm.
So I'm trying to think off the top of my head of a good example of a booth that I've seen recently, but there really aren't too many. What I see a lot is words like accelerate and and molecule to market
Hmm.
and uh, you know uh, best at this and best at that and so forth. And it's a lot of messaging about us, the CDMO, and not about the customers. So if somebody is doing a sterile fill finish for products,
Hmm.
I need to know that, right? Because I might be looking for a sterile fill finish provider. But what am I really looking for? Am I looking for capacity? Am I looking for speed? Am I looking for quality? Am I looking to go all the way to commercial scale, or am I looking to go into phase one in a clinical trial? I've got to be able to differentiate as a
Hmm.
customer between people that are displaying that similar booth messaging. I see in booths a lot too, that kind of laundry list of services. There's no way for me as a floor walker to read through that laundry list to look for and try and understand how this service or that service might be valuable to me.
Hmm. Hmm. Yep.
So the company has to lead with why I should work with them.
It feels to me like you've been particularly attracted to sales, which almost seems unusual for someone whose background is in science and with a PhD. Is that fair, would you say?
Well, I'd say that is probably the biggest challenge for scientists a lot of times to understand that it's not just your expertise that people are buying, it's your ability to connect with what their problem is. And so
Mm.
to me, the nature of a sales conversation is digging deep into the customer's problem that they're trying to solve and trying to determine whether you're the best person to solve it, whether your approach will even work,
Hmm.
whether whether there's value in solving it beyond the cost of what they would have to pay you. What's the impact on other parts of the organization? There's so much there to unpack. And very frequently, what we get when we get into a sales conversation as a scientist is somebody says, "Can you do this?" And
Hmm.
then you're all about responding to, "Yes, here is what we do, and here's what it costs." And none of that conversation ever seems to happen. And I think that part of that is just that as a scientist, I learned very, very early on to talk about what I know
Hmm.
and not talk about things that I don't know. In other words,
Mm.
don't speculate, don't be subjective, try to be objective.
Following the scientific method.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess my contention would be if you're a scientist, there's a scientific method to selling as well. It just
Mm.
requires that you be prepared to get answers that you don't know what's going to happen next.
Mm.
You be
Mm.
prepared to have a conversation around things that are not known, that are not comfortable ground for you to stand on. So, yes, you're being hired for your expertise, you're being hired for your skills, you're being hired for the uniqueness of what you know how to do. But at the same time, you have to get out of that mindset and into trying to understand what your potential customer needs.
So in the book, you talk about how important it is as you scale to build functional heads around you. As a leader, you should keep hold of no more than one of those functions as you scale the business. It seems to me that sales feels like the thing that you wanted to retain control of. Why was it that function rather than operations or marketing or the other bits of the business?
Well, I think that sales and marketing are closely related because, particularly when your company is small, you can do a tremendous amount with digital domain marketing that will bring you some amount of sales. And it will
Mm.
certainly prepare you for the sales conversations that you're going to have once you get into a real discussion with a potential customer. So, I'm not going to say that sales and marketing are the same field, but I am going to say that they're closely related. And
Yep.
so maybe one of the three main job functions, operations, finance and administration, and sales and marketing. One of those is encompassing of both of those approaches,
Yep.
technologies.
Yep.
But I don't know. Personally, I did all of those things. The first role that I was able to hire a competent person into to take over for me was operations. It's sometimes easier for a scientist to find another good scientist like them. They're already part of your network. You can bring in people that you know and trust, and then you can turn over operations fairly readily. My company didn't really begin to take off until I found somebody that was capable of handling the finance and administration. So we brought in a chief operating officer. And that was an important step forward. And then that left me by default in the sales and marketing.
That freed you up to be more customer facing, did it?
Yeah, and I think that that's still always essential when we're talking about selling our scientific expertise. It's at some point during the conversation, it's required that you prove that you're an expert. So in a lot of businesses, that means bringing in a subject matter expert. If you're a sales representative, you establish a conversation with a customer, at some point you've got to bring in that subject matter expertise into the conversation. You're very, very lucky if you have it yourself because you can perform two roles. But that doesn't always happen.
Interested to get your views from the other side of the table, so from the sponsors and how they can get the most from a partnership with a CRO or a CDMO. We're at a time, obviously, where there's been really high global inflation, and on the buy side, people are looking at all sorts of different options. So on one hand, you've got, your very transactional relationships. On the other end of the scale, you've got the recent news of Catalent and Novo Nordisk looking at a big vertical integration on the other end. What would be your recommendation for sponsors who are looking to get the best out of partnerships with contract service providers?
Yeah, I think it depending on the sponsor, right? So let's inherently assume that the small virtual company with one product in the pipeline that is looking to move into the clinic as rapidly as possible has different needs than a Merck or a Pfizer or a Novo Nordisk, right? For the larger sponsors, for ones with multiple programs looking for long-term partnerships, it does make some sense to look at these integrated, large, potentially global CDMOs that can do everything. But you have to recognize as a sponsor that requires more of your resources be used in managing that relationship. Because you're going to be working with different resources over the course of a program, over the timeline of a program in different locations, different teams. Leadership in those teams is going to shift. You're in it for a long-term partnership. And once you've invested deeply in that long-term partnership, there's a huge activation barrier to change. A friend of mine at Pfizer many years ago used to call this the tyranny of the installed base. So if you invested in laboratory equipment all from one instrument company, let's say Agilent, it was very, very hard to change and buy a Waters HPLC or Shimadzu mass spectrometer because you were already so heavily in bed with Agilent. It's the same thing with service providers, right? Once you've begun to use these large companies for all of your drug development program support in one area, it's very, very difficult to bring on another partner. Very, very difficult to switch. And that's got costs. But if you're a small virtual company, what you're probably looking for are specific capabilities. And what you're doing is rather than managing the individual providers, you're managing the program itself across the length of its timeline and trying to decide what resources do we need to move it fastest from here to here to here. So it becomes a matter of good management internally of the science versus good management externally of the resources. Does that make sense? It's a long and convoluted answer, but
no, it makes complete sense. In your experience, is there a middle way, somewhere between transactional and an out-and-out acquisition, partnerships that you've had where both sides had a long and fruitful partnership? What do you find works well, incentivizing the contract service provider to really consistently give you the best work?
Yeah, I think that when I was running Averica, we had relationships with sponsors who referred to us as capabilities providers. So, in other words, instead of program support, they were looking for support for individual scientific tasks. And as a capabilities provider, I wasn't interested in being a broad services group that offered everything that would support development of a molecule and getting it into the clinic. We did what we did. And that was a comfortable place for me to be as a scientist because it allowed me to lean on what myself and my team knew how to do very, very well. I read a lot of articles and I'm sure you do too, and your audience does, in publications like Outsourced Pharma or Contract Pharma or whatever, and they're about how to manage your CDMO relationship. Well, that's great, but they're all written from the perspective of a consultant who has a role in helping companies manage their CDMO relationships. So I mean, they're a little bit self-serving from that standpoint, and they cover the spectrum of how to write legal agreements so that you're fully covered, how to manage the project, what to do if things go wrong, how to manage a change in project leadership, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We didn't have to deal with that as a capabilities provider. We managed each individual customer relationship separately. And the best ones for me, to go back to your original question, the best ones for me were where the customers would repeat because they developed a trust that we could get things done for them and they understood the timelines. So there weren't a lot of mysteries left for them in how we would contribute to their program. And that left us in the very comfortable position of being able to occasionally we could call up and say, hey, listen, we saw something interesting with your compound or with your project. Would you like us to pursue this more? Would you like us to investigate further? And that would often result in a change order or whatever that brought some additional profitability to our operation, but it also deepened our relationship with the customer. So once you're trusted for what you already know how to do, the chances that you can deepen that relationship grow fantastically.
And presumably you get invited in more into what's coming up in the pipeline and you can do more forward planning together in collaboration around those specific capabilities.
Right. And also it's probably the best way because we all do have capabilities that are broader than just our narrow area of expertise, right? So if you've been marketing yourself narrowly in order to find your ideal customers, great. You're going to have opportunities to extend that and do other work as long as you stay within an area where you know you can offer value.
Thank you. Have you been pleased with the reception of Expert to Entrepreneur? I see you're on the Amazon bestsellers list within the business category. Are you happy with how it's been going?
I am happy. It's been a great tool for me to get to meet more people. I've enjoyed these kind of conversations on podcasts. They've been a lot of fun for me to have. Everybody that I meet that's even just flipped through the book casually has an interesting question that we can dive into a little bit. So, I don't know that it's the book itself is not going to make me a rich person. The world of business writing is there's a lot out there, and any given bookstore probably has one or two shelves that are devoted to business books, and they're full of the standard offerings like good to great. So I'm going to sell it through Amazon, through a couple of other channels, and continue to promote it. What I think has been most gratifying is a few speaking engagements that I've had where I get to speak to a larger audience. That's something I've always enjoyed.
Well, Jeff, thank you so much for your time. Pleasure speaking to you today.
Well, you're very welcome. It was quite a pleasure.
As mentioned, Jeff will be delivering a talk at CDMO Live on the topic of how contract manufacturers should align sales and marketing. CDMO Live is a new online event designed to connect you with the latest insights and innovative partners in contract manufacturing. We've put together an in-depth programme of expert talks and roundtables to help you work with CDMOs to accelerate drug development, decarbonise Scope 3 emissions, and optimise contract manufacturing networks. To find out more, head to pharmasource.global/CDMO Live. And thank you to Thermo Fisher for sponsoring the PharmaSource podcast.